Memory for speech of varying intelligibility. Effects of perception and production of clear speech on recall and recognition memory for native and non-native listeners and talkers. This work investigates the link between perceptual clarity and higher-level cognitive processes involved in memory. It examines memory for speech perceived and speech produced, and compares native and non-native speech processing and retention of spoken information. This research has the potential to inform various applied settings where retention of information is crucial or critical, such as classrooms and hospitals. Clear speech is a listener-oriented speaking style. There are other listener-oriented speaking styles, such as Lombard speech or infant-directed speech. What makes clear speech unique is that it is a broad speaking style adaptation that talkers do spontaneously in response to listeners' difficulties, such as hearing impairment or linguistic background. Articulatory acoustic modifications typically include slower speaking rate, more pauses, longer pauses, etc. On the right here is an example of a spectrogram and waveform of the same sentence produced by the same speaker in conversational style.
The boy carried the heavy chair.
And in clear style.
The boy carried the heavy chair.
You will immediately notice the slower speaking rate in clear speech. Segments, like in boy, are much longer. Articulatory targets are more likely reached, reflected in, for instance, more extreme form and values. And pauses are overall more frequent and longer. Clear speech improves intelligibility for a wide range of listeners: young adults, older adults, children, etc. Non-native listeners, especially less proficient non-native listeners, seem to benefit from listening to clear speech, but to a lesser extent than native listeners or highly proficient non-native listeners. Also, they can produce intelligibility-enhancing clear speech, but somewhat less successfully in terms of intelligibility gains compared to native talkers. This may be due to non-native speakers' lack of experience in attending to the relevant phonemic and phonetic cues in their second language. To sum up, we know from the literature that signal-related articulatory acoustic enhancements in the form of clear speech improve signal-dependent peripheral processing such as vowel and word recognition and noise. However, the effect of clear speech on signal-independent, higher-level cognitive processes such as memory are not well known. This is the gap this dissertation is intending to fill. Mixed results are found in terms of the effects of perceptual clarity on memory. On the one hand, in the visual domain, perceptual clarity such as visually intact non-blurred words or higher visual acuity seem to enhance memory. On the other hand, perceptual interference effect or desirable difficulty show that perceptual disfluencies, so lack of clarity, such as harder to read fonts or partially masked information, also seem to improve memory. In the clear speech domain of research, 3 studies that looked at recognition memory in native listeners and recall in older adults show that speech clarity in the form of clear speech improves memory. Since clear speech enhances intelligibility by providing more exaggerated and salient acoustic cues, it may decrease processing difficulties and cognitive load. According to the effortfulness hypothesis, we have a limited pool of cognitive resources, and effortful speech processing may use up more cognitive resources, leaving fewer available for memory encoding. So clear speech may free up cognitive resources necessary to encode speech in memory. In the present investigation, I conducted a series of experiments building upon our existing knowledge and further exploring the clear speech benefit on memory. The first 2 studies examined the effect of clear speech perception on memory, that is, how listeners who perceive clear speech remember it. And in the third study, I examined the effect of clear speech production on memory, that is, how talkers who produce clear speech remember it. In both perception and production, I investigated the memory for clear speech using 2 memory tasks, recognition memory and recall, looking at both native and non-native speakers of English. The first study built upon previous work examining within-modal recognition memory of clear speech for native listeners by comparing within and cross-modal recognition memory for native and non-native listeners. In this recognition memory experiment, in the exposure phase, listeners heard a total of 40 sentences, half in conversational and half in clear speech, and were asked to listen and memorize. In the test phase, they were presented with double amount of sentences, 80 sentences, 40 from the exposure and 40 new, and they were asked to indicate for each sentence whether the sentence is old from exposure or new. In the within model condition, participants heard the test sentences presented over headphones, in the same audio modality as the exposure sentences. In the cross-modal condition, participants saw the test sentences orthographically written on the screen, and therefore in a different modality from the exposure sentences. In within-modal recognition memory, in the test phase, listeners match incoming speech signals to already encoded speech signals and must make a decision about the familiarity of the item. It is possible that the many salient acoustic characteristics in exaggerated clear speech provide more distinctive cues that facilitate acoustic matching. This would be an acoustically driven memory benefit in clear speech. Testing cross-modal recognition memory allowed to investigate whether the clear speech benefit is still present when no lower-level acoustic comparisons are possible and when listeners only have orthographical input in the test phase. If the clear speech benefit is still present, this would suggest deeper linguistic encoding in clear speech at a level abstracted from the input speech, and it would support the idea that the benefit is derived from less cognitive effort during memory encoding. 30 listeners in each group and experiment participated for a total of 120 listeners. The non-native group was defined according to roughly the same criteria throughout the entire dissertation. The non-native participants were all college-aged students at the University of Texas at Austin. This implies that they had a certain proficiency level in English to be able to attend classes in a U.S. university. They were from various first language backgrounds, they were first exposed to English after age 6, and arrived to the U.S. in their late teens on average. Here were the key findings. In this graph on the y-axis are the average D-prime scores. Higher D-prime scores indicate enhanced memory. Native listeners are plotted on the left, non-native on the right, conversational in gray, and clear in white. In within model recognition memory, notice how recognition memory was better in clear speech for both listener groups. This experiment alone extended results from previous studies which found a within model recognition memory benefit for native listeners by showing that non-native listeners also benefited from clear speech. Additional novel findings were in cross-modal recognition memory. Notice how cross-modal recognition memory was also better for clear speech sentences for both listener groups. Enhanced cross-modal recognition memory in clear speech indicates that the clear speech benefit may not only be a lower-level benefit by matching acoustic signals, but a higher-level benefit likely due to improved holistic, lexical, semantic, and syntactic encoding. This supports the effortfulness hypothesis and the idea that easier-to-understand clear speech frees up cognitive resources for memory consolidation. Important takeaway message is that clear speech improved memory for both listener groups, regardless of L1 background. Note that there was evidence for cost of L2 language processing on memory. Cross-modal recognition memory overall was more difficult for non-native listeners compared to native listeners. The second study looked at listeners' memory for clear speech using a different memory task, recall. This study builds on the first one by examining the amount and content of what listeners remembered and not only recognizing something as previously heard. In this task, listeners heard 12 sentences in one style and were then asked to recall the 12 sentences on a recall booklet. In total, they repeated this procedure 6 times, alternating block in clear and conversational speech. Keywords were scored as correct or incorrect. Responses were also scored at the sentence level by categorizing each sentence response as belonging to one of 5 categories, with no overlapping membership possible: verbatim, paraphrase, partial, error, and omit. 57 native and 31 non-native listeners participated for a total of 88 participants. Here were the key findings. In this graph, the y-axis represents percent keyword accurately recalled. On the left, the native listeners, on the right, the non-native listeners. Conversational is in gray, clear in white. Results showed a clear speech benefit such that more keywords in clear speech were recalled than in conversational speech by both native and non-native listeners. At the sentence level, in clear speech, there were more verbatim answers, that is, whole sentences that form entire unit of connected meaning were recalled more accurately and entirely in clear speech and not just a list of words. In clear speech, there were also fewer errors and omitted answers. Regardless of speaking style, when comparing groups, non-native listeners recalled fewer entire sentences and did more partial responses, so they were somewhat less likely to recall entire unit of connected meaning. They also made fewer errors compared to native listeners, but they omitted more responses. This suggests that non-native listeners were more uncertain and less likely to guess responses. In line with previous research, this finding contributes to show that non-native listeners experience difficulty in integrating top-down lexical and syntactic knowledge to predict words in a sentence. Crucially, this study showed a speaking style effect such that clear speech enhanced recall of words and entire sentences for both native and non-native listeners. Finally, for the third study, I adopted a different perspective and examined the effects of producing clear speech on memory for the talkers themselves. The first experiment investigated the effect of reading aloud in clear and conversational speech on memory using a recognition memory task. In the exposure phase, talkers read aloud 60 sentences first. Every 10 sentences, they alternated speaking styles. After producing all sentences, they completed the recognition memory test by indicating whether each sentence on the screen was old from exposure or new. In the second experiment, using a recall task, new participants read aloud a block of 12 sentences in one speaking style and then wrote down what they remembered from the 12 sentences on a recall booklet. In total, they completed 6 blocks alternating in speaking style for a total of 3 blocks in clear and 3 blocks in conversational. In addition to performing acoustic analyses which confirmed that participants implemented typical conversational to clear speech adaptations, I compared speech onset latency in both speaking styles. This measure corresponds to the time elapsed between the moment that the stimulus sentence appeared written on the screen and the time that the talkers initiated speech. I use this as a proxy for speech planning duration and a possible indication of effort involved in speech planning for different speaking styles. 165 talkers participated across experiments. 60 native and 30 non-native talkers participated in experiment 1, and 43 native and 32 non-native in experiment 2. Here were the key findings. On the left are the results for experiment 1 recognition memory. DPREM scores are plotted on the y-axis. Native on the left panel, non-native on the right, and within each panel, conversational on the left and clear on the right. DPREM scores were statistically significantly lower for clear speech than for conversational speech for both talker groups. Similar results were found when looking at percent keyword recall in experiment 2. Percent keyword recall were also statistically significantly lower in clear than in conversational speech for both groups. So overall, memory, whether examined using recognition memory or recall, was found to be lower for clear than conversational speech. This is in the opposite direction from the perception results. We are to wonder then why clear speech production was disruptive for memory. Speech onset latency suggests some answers. Speech onset latency is represented on the y-axis in milliseconds. In conversational style, speech onset latency was around 750-800 milliseconds for native and non-native talkers. Now, in clear speech, speech onset latency was significantly longer for both talker groups. In experiment 2 recall, similar pattern of results were observed. Native and non-native talkers required significantly more time to initiate speech when reading aloud in clear compared to conversational speech. If we consider longer speech onset latency as an indication of speech planning effort, then higher speech planning effort in clear speech may have recruited cognitive resources otherwise needed to encode speech in memory. This could explain the results we observed in memory performance. Let's summarize and take a look at all the memory results combined. What are the effects of clear speech perception and production on memory? In clear speech perception, listeners in both recognition memory and recall tasks showed enhanced memory performance for clear speech compared to conversational speech. This was not the case in clear speech production experiments, where talkers remembered less speech they produced clearly compared to conversationally. The goal of the dissertation was to examine the effects of signal-related articulatory acoustic enhancements, clear speech, on signal-independent, higher-level cognitive processes, memory. The results show that the clear speech benefit goes beyond improved word recognition in noise to include improved memory for the listeners. Another important finding was clear speech production impaired memory for the talkers. Seemingly disparate findings in perception and production can be reconciled by the effortfulness hypothesis. The two modalities may compete for the same cognitive resources. In perception, easier to understand clear speech frees up listeners' cognitive resources for memory processes. In production, planning and producing clear speech requires more cognitive resources, limiting their use for memory processes. The strength of this work is that it probed memory using a variety of memory paradigms, each of which indexes different aspects of memory, which allowed more robust and comprehensive findings. Overall, this dissertation revealed that native and non-native listeners and talkers showed similar results in terms of the overall effect of clear speech on memory. In perception, clear speech enhanced memory for non-native listeners, suggesting that more intelligible speech freed up some cognitive resources even during the more difficult L2 speech processing. In production, higher cognitive load in producing clear speech may have detrimentally affected memory encoding, similarly in L1 and in L2. However, there were a few differences. This dissertation highlighted a greater cost for cross-modal integration and retrieval of information, and greater reliance on acoustic input for non-native listeners. It also provided evidence for greater difficulty in using top-down knowledge to fill in missing information at the signal level for non-native listeners. Note that the findings and conclusions drawn are for non-native participants that were all proficient enough to attend college in the US. It remains to be seen how the clear speech memory benefit is modulated by variation in L2 proficiency, and in particular for L2 learners who are in the early stages of L2 acquisition. Future work should delineate how the production and perception modalities compete for various cognitive resources, such as selective attention and working memory. To truly evaluate the real-life application of the clear speech advantage on memory, it would be important to measure the effect of clear speech on memory in more realistic environments, using educationally relevant or medically relevant paragraphs and interactive tasks, for example. To also further assess the clear speech benefit boundary, it's important to examine the effect in different populations experiencing qualitatively different perceptual challenges, such as developing children with or without learning difficulties, or older adults with or without hearing loss who experience inherent peripheral and cognitive decline. Also, knowledge should be gained from collecting objective and subjective measures of speech planning and articulatory cognitive effort involved in producing clear speech. Finally, the temporal boundary of the clear speech benefit on memory remains to be tested, in particular whether the benefit persists after an intervening task or after overnight consolidation. This dissertation provides new insights into the link between lower-level peripheral perceptual clarity and higher-level cognitive processes. Clarity at the lower level may facilitate encoding and retention processes at the higher level. This dissertation also enhances our understanding of speech perception and production and their impact on cognitive effort. In particular, it highlighted mismatches between perception and production. This dissertation provides novel findings in speech processing and integration of spoken information in memory in L2.